New horror story. My grandfather hid the truth about our basement for 30 years. The real estate agent wouldn't look me in the eye when she handed me the keys to my grandfather's house. And when I asked her about the basement door at the end of the hallway, the one with 3 different deadbolts and a faded warning sign that read, "Authorized personnel only," she just said the previous owners had been eccentric about storage. What she didn't mention was that my grandfather had been found at the bottom of those basement stairs with his neck broken, or that the local fire department had spent 6 hours trying to retrieve his body from what should have been a simple 12-step staircase. I inherited the house in Millfield, Maine because I was Thomas Brennan's only living relative, though we'd never been close. He'd been a mining engineer who'd retired to this isolated Victorian house 30 years ago and rarely spoke to anyone in town. The neighbors described him as obsessive about keeping people away from his property, especially from the basement. One elderly woman mentioned that she'd seen lights moving down there at all hours of the night, and sometimes heard what sounded like construction work. Hammering, drilling, the echo of tools against stone, coming from beneath the house. My name is Ethan, and I thought I was inheriting a simple 3-bedroom house with maybe some valuable antiques in the basement. I was wrong about the antiques. I was wrong about the simplicity. And I was catastrophically wrong about what was waiting for me at the bottom of those stairs. The house itself was unremarkable, built in 1993 and maintained well enough over the decades. Dark hardwood floors, high ceilings, and the kind of ornate woodwork they don't make anymore. Everything was clean and organized, almost obsessively so, as if my grandfather had spent his final years preparing for someone to inspect his life. But there was an underlying smell throughout the house, something musty and organic, like soil that had been disturbed after lying still for too long. The basement door was solid oak, much heavier than it needed to be, fitted with a deadbolt, a chain lock, and a sliding bolt that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. The warning sign was handwritten in my grandfather's careful script, but underneath it was another sign, older and faded, that simply read, "Do not descend past level 3. I assumed it was some kind of joke or reference to his mining background. I unlocked all 3 locks and opened the door to find a normal-looking wooden staircase descending into darkness. 12 steps down to what appeared to be a typical, unfinished basement. I flipped the light switch and saw concrete walls, a few storage boxes, some old furniture covered with sheets. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would require 3 locks or a warning sign. I descended the stairs to take a quick inventory of anything valuable. At the bottom of the stairs, I found something that made no sense. The basement was normal. Concrete floor, exposed ceiling joists about 20 feet by 30 feet. But in the far corner, there was another staircase. Not a ladder to an upper floor, but another set of wooden steps leading further down, disappearing into darkness below the foundation line. The stairs were built into the concrete as if they'd been there since the house was constructed, but that was impossible. The basement was already below ground level. I descended the second staircase, telling myself there must be a sub-basement or root cellar I hadn't known about. This level was different. The walls were hewn stone instead of concrete, older looking, and the air was noticeably cooler. It was about the same size as the level above, but arranged differently, with alcoves carved into the rock walls. Some contained more storage boxes. Others held old mining equipment. Picks, shovels, lengths of rope, helmets with carbide lamps. In one alcove, I found a stack of journals bound in cracked leather. And in the far corner of this level, there was another staircase leading down. The journals belonged to my grandfather, dating back to when he'd first bought the house. The early entries were mundane. Renovation plans, notes about replacing the furnace, complaints about the neighbor's dog. But about 6 months after moving in, the entries became strange. Thomas wrote about hearing sounds from the basement, about finding the second staircase during a routine inspection for water damage. He described his decision to explore what he called the extended levels beneath his house. According to his journal, my grandfather had discovered that the staircases continued down for at least 6 levels, each one different from the last. Level 3 was a natural cave system carved from the bedrock. Level 4 was built from fitted stone blocks, like the foundation of a much older structure. Level 5 was something he described as architecturally impossible, a space larger than the footprint of his house, with corridors leading in directions that shouldn't exist, Level 6 was where he stopped writing detailed descriptions and simply noted the date and time of each descent. His final entries, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, mentioned the others who lived in the deeper levels. He wrote that they'd been there long before the house was built, long before the town existed, possibly since the Ice Age. They weren't hostile, according to Thomas, just protective of their space. But they didn't like visitors, and they especially didn't like anyone who tried to map or document their domain. The last entry was dated 3 days before his death. They've been following me back up. I can hear them on level 2 at night. I think they want me to join them permanently. I closed the journal and looked around the stone level where I was standing. The alcoves suddenly seemed less like storage spaces and more like watching posts. The shadows between them appeared deeper, more mobile. I decided to check out level 3 just to satisfy my curiosity about what my grandfather had discovered. Level 3 was a natural cave system, just as he'd described. The wooden stairs ended at a stone platform, and from there the floor was uneven rock, worn smooth by water over thousands of years. The space was larger than the levels above, extending beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. The air smelled of minerals and something organic. Not decay exactly, but the scent of things that had lived in darkness for a very long time. Carved into the cave walls were symbols I didn't recognize. Not primitive cave paintings, but deliberate markings that looked almost like a written language. Some were fresh, clearly carved recently, while others were so old they'd nearly weathered away. I found evidence that my grandfather had spent considerable time down here. A folding chair, battery-powered lanterns, notebooks filled with sketches of the symbols and attempted translations. But what disturbed me most were the other signs of habitation. Smooth depressions in the stone floor where something large might rest, scratches on the walls at heights no human could reach, and pathways leading deeper into the cave system, worn smooth as if by regular use. From somewhere in the darkness below I heard movement. Not the scurrying of rodents or the flutter of bats, but deliberate, purposeful sounds. Footsteps, if the creatures making them had feet. A rhythmic tapping that might have been communication. And underneath it all, a low humming sound that seemed to come from the stone itself. I returned to the surface and spent the next day reading through all of my grandfather's journals. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd become obsessed with the levels beneath his house, descending deeper and deeper while documenting what he found. His handwriting deteriorated over the years, becoming more frantic and erratic. He wrote about making contact with the deep dwellers and learning to communicate with them through combinations of sound and symbol. According to Thomas, the creatures weren't malevolent, but they operated by rules humans couldn't fully understand. They allowed him to visit their domain as long as he respected certain boundaries and never brought others down with him. They'd been living in the deep levels since long before humans had arrived in this region, possibly since the last ice age had carved out the cave system. But in his final entries, Thomas wrote about changes in their behavior. They'd become more territorial, more interested in the surface world. They'd started following him back up to the higher levels, and he'd begun finding evidence of their presence on level 2. Scratches on the walls, arrangements of stones that hadn't been there before, signs that they were expanding their territory upward. Despite everything I'd read, I couldn't stop myself from exploring deeper. It was partly curiosity and partly a compulsion I couldn't explain. Level 4 was exactly as Thomas had described, a constructed space built from fitted stone blocks, like the foundation of an ancient building. The craftsmanship was incredible, with no mortar between the stones, but joints so tight that a knife blade couldn't fit between them. This level felt older than anything else I'd encountered, predating any known architecture in the region. Level 5 was where reality began to break down. The space was impossibly large, extending far beyond the footprint of the house above. Corridors branched off in all directions, some sloping upward, others descending at angles that made no geometric sense. The air moved differently here, sometimes flowing up from below, sometimes being drawn down as if the entire level was breathing. I found more evidence of my grandfather's presence. Camping equipment, notebooks, measuring tools he'd used to try to map the impossible layout. But I also found things that weren't his. Arrangements of bones from animals I couldn't identify. carvings in the walls that were definitely not human work, and sounds echoing from the deeper passages. The same rhythmic tapping I'd heard on level 3, but closer now, more frequent. On level 6, I encountered the dwellers directly. They weren't what I'd expected. Not quite human, but not entirely alien either. Tall, thin figures adapted for life in complete darkness, with elongated limbs and oversensitive eyes that reflected light like an animal's. They moved through the caves with perfect silence, and they watched me with an intelligence that was definitely not primitive. When I first saw one standing in a passage about 50 feet away, my instinct was to run. But the creature didn't approach or threaten me. It simply observed as if trying to determine whether I belonged there. Over the course of several visits, I encountered more of them. They seemed to communicate through a combination of the tapping sounds and subtle changes in the air currents, modifications they could make to the cave environment that carried meaning I couldn't interpret. They never came close enough to touch, but they followed me through the passages, maintaining a constant distance that felt like escort rather than stalking. I began to understand why my grandfather had become obsessed. The dwellers weren't just living in the caves, they were maintaining them. The passages were part of a larger system that extended far beyond what I could explore, connecting to other cave networks throughout the region. The creatures had been managing this underground environment for millennia, and they allowed certain humans to witness it as long as those humans didn't pose a threat to their secrecy. But something had changed. The dwellers were no longer content to remain hidden in the deep levels. They'd begun expanding upward, claiming territory closer to the surface. I found evidence of this on every level. New passages being carved, living spaces being prepared, signs that they were planning to establish a permanent presence in the upper caves. My grandfather's final journal entries suggested he'd try to negotiate with them, to establish boundaries that would keep them away from the surface levels. But the dwellers operated on timescales that made human concerns irrelevant. They'd been patient for thousands of years, and now they'd decided it was time to reclaim territory they considered rightfully theirs. I also began to suspect that my grandfather hadn't died accidentally. His final entries mentioned feeling called to make one last descent, a compulsion he couldn't resist. The dwellers had ways of influencing human behavior, subtle manipulations that could make someone act against their own survival instincts. Thomas had become too involved in their world, and they'd ensured he could never leave it. After 2 weeks of daily descents, I started experiencing the same compulsions. I would wake up thinking about the passages I hadn't explored, the conversations I might have with the dwellers if I could learn their communication methods. I began spending entire days in the caves, losing track of time, forgetting to eat or sleep. The surface world started feeling temporary and irrelevant compared to the ancient permanence of the deep levels. That's when I realized I needed to leave the house before I suffered my grandfather's fate. I contacted Dr. Raymond Wells, a geology professor at the University of Maine who specialized in cave systems. I told him about the unusual passages beneath my house, describing them as a potentially significant geological discovery rather than mentioning the dwellers. Dr. Wells was immediately interested and assembled a team to survey what I'd found. When his team arrived with professional equipment and spelunking gear, the dwellers vanished completely. The passages below level 5 appeared to have been sealed with rockfalls that looked completely natural. Level 6, where I'd encountered the creatures directly, was inaccessible behind tons of collapsed stone. Dr. Wells concluded that the cave system had been unstable and that my grandfather had probably died in a similar collapse. But I found a note left in my grandfather's journals, written in a hand that wasn't his. The arrangement is concluded. Your debt is paid. Do not return. I sold the house to Dr. Wells University for their geological research, with the stipulation that the basement remain off limits to casual exploration. I moved back to Portland and tried to resume my normal life. For the most part, I've been successful in putting the experience behind me. I sleep better now, and I no longer feel compelled to explore dark places or seek out underground spaces. But sometimes I have dreams about the deep levels, about passages extending infinitely into the earth, about creatures who measure time in geological epochs and who remember when this region was covered by ice sheets. In these dreams, I'm still descending the staircases, going deeper and deeper, and the dwellers are waiting for me at the bottom, patient as stone, ready to welcome me into their permanent darkness. Last month, Dr. Wells called to tell me they'd had to seal the basement entrance permanently. His research team had reported equipment malfunctions, strange sounds echoing from below, and several instances of team members wandering off during cave surveys and being found hours later in passages that hadn't been mapped. One researcher claimed to have seen figures moving in the deeper caves, but his colleagues assumed it was a hallucination caused by prolonged exposure to underground environments. Dr. Wells also mentioned that similar cave systems had been discovered beneath other houses in Millfield, all of them properties that had been abandoned by their owners under mysterious circumstances. The university was conducting a broader geological survey, but they were having difficulty keeping research teams in the field. Too many accidents, too many instances of equipment failure, too many researchers requesting transfers to other projects. The dwellers weren't gone. They'd just retreated to deeper levels, waiting for the surface interest to fade so they could continue their slow expansion upward. And sometimes, when I'm walking through downtown Portland and pass by a storm drain or subway entrance, I can swear I hear that rhythmic tapping echoing up from below, reminding me that the deep levels exist everywhere, that the dwellers have been patient for thousands of years, and that they're still waiting for humans to descend far enough to join them permanently. The staircases all lead down eventually, and something is always waiting at the bottom. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this dark journey, hit the like button and subscribe. New horror documentaries every single night here on Trumbull Dreams.